You're listening to Navigating the French on Paris Underground Radio. For more great content and a bonus episode of Navigating the French, please join us on Patreon.
Hello, and welcome to Navigating the French, the podcast where each episode we take a look at a French word and try and see what it tells us about French culture. I'm your host, Emily Monaco. Today I'm joined by Rosa Jackson, the owner of Les Petits Farçis cooking school in Nice. She's here to explore a word that's about way more than salad. Niçoise. I'm so very excited to have Rosa Jackson here on the podcast today. Welcome, Rosa. Thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you for inviting me.
We are really excited to have you on right now. I mean, I've been following your work for a really long time, but something new and exciting has just emerged onto the culinary landscape. Can you tell us a little bit about who you are, what you do, and what has recently happened that is so very exciting?
Sure. So I've been based in France for 30 years, and I've been writing about food and leading food tours and teaching cooking throughout that time at various different phases of my career. And I've been based in Nice for the last 20 years. And when I moved to Nice in 2004, I decided to start my own cooking school, which is called Les Petits Farçis. And I focused entirely on the cuisine of Nice because in Paris, I'd been exposed to classic cooking, to cooking of all the different regions of France. But when I came to Nice, I became very interested in the regional cuisine that I found down here because it was little known in the rest of France. It's very Mediterranean. It uses a lot of vegetables and produce. And I felt that there were dishes that I wanted to introduce people to that you could really only find in Nice. So I thought this was a perfect place to create my small cooking school. I started in my home, later moved to a space in 2015 in the Old Town that's dedicated to teaching. And when the pandemic hit, I have found myself a little extra time. And I had long been thinking about writing a cookbook. And many of my students had asked me, when are you going to have a book? And it was something I had already been working on. It wasn't a new idea for me, but it was finally the opportunity to take the time to write that book I'd always been dreaming about doing. And it's a book about Niçoise cuisine. The word Niçoise, not everybody knows, refers to something or someone from Nice. And it's got 100 recipes from the area, mostly traditional, but some that I've learned since I've from people who've come here from other countries as well. So it's not just, recipes that have been made here for centuries. And yeah, I'm very proud of it. The editor is Norton in New York. And I had a wonderful photographer named Jan Hendrik van der Westhuizen, who is South African and runs a Michelin-starred restaurant in Nice. So it's a beautiful book full of gorgeous photos and recipes that have been tested and retested.
Well, it's a very exciting book. It's a beautiful book. And it's sort of the continuity of this, mission that you've set yourself, a mission of passion, but to kind of profile what makes Nice so special. Because as we've explored previously on the podcast, for anyone who's listened to the episode on Provence, often when we talk about France, we talk about Paris and then everything else outside of Paris. But obviously, every region has its own specificity, and Nice perhaps more than so many others because it historically, culturally, even linguistically, has a completely different sort of origin. So just sort of from a historical standpoint, what makes Nice stand out culturally from the rest of France, to your mind?
When you come to Nice, the thing you need to keep in mind is that it's only been French since 1860. So for several centuries before that, it belonged to the Kingdom of Savoy, which was ruled out of Piedmont and Sardinia. So there's a very strong link between Niçoise and Italian food. But at the same time, Niçoise food is not quite Italian. So that's something that I really enjoy exploring is the similarities and differences between the food of Italy, and that could be Liguria, Piedmont, the regions that Nice has been tied to for, the past few centuries, and French cooking. And so I do feel that Niçoise cuisine is French more than it's Italian. But at the same time, we have fresh pasta, we have polenta, gnocchi, and these things that you might expect to find more in Italy, but they're always adapted to local ingredients and local culture. So it's really a place where France meets Italy.
That's really awesome. And so obviously from a culinary perspective, that's true. And, you know, we spend a lot of time on this podcast talking about French culture. And it makes me wonder, you know, you living so close to Italy, spending time in Paris, spending time in Nice, spending time in Italy, do you notice any other sort of ways in which the culture of Nice kind of bridges that gap between France and Italy, either in, you know, the warmth of the people or, you know, the obsession with mothers? I don't know. Is there anything that feels a little less French, a little more Niçoise?
Yeah, I'd say people are very expressive here. And when I first moved here, I had lived in Paris where people are still relatively reserved. I would say they're a bit more northern in the way they express themselves. And I noticed it more because I had a young son when I moved to Nice. And when he was at the daycare in Paris, the women were very nice, but rather reserved in the way they displayed affection. And then when he came to Nice, all the kids were running around in diapers with no other clothes on. And the women were grabbing them and hugging them and then yelling at them. And, there was just a lot more expression of emotion here. And sometimes I would get confused at the market because people were yelling at each other. And then I realized it was a joke. And so there's a way, like a humor, which can seem a little bit aggressive sometimes, but it's actually just like when you tease someone, it's a way of showing affection. And that to me is very Mediterranean. In Italy, it is a different feel. I go to Italy quite a bit, and there's generally a kind of festive feel in Italy that I get when I cross the border, that everyone's kind of having fun. They're pretty laid back. They're not worried about things too much. Whereas in Nice, there is that slight French side of liking to complain. So, they'll complain about the weather because, oh my God, it's raining. We get 50 days of rain a year, but we're going to complain every time. So, there is that sort of French tendency to complain, along with the Italian tendency to wave your arms around and talk loud and express emotions.
Well, it definitely sounds like a fun place to live.
Yeah.
When you moved to Nice, I mean, aside from the ones that you mentioned, were there any big culture shocks you experienced coming from Paris, whether it's something small like, oh, they do the bees differently, to the time of day they eat, or anything like that made it feel different?
Lots of things. Yeah, they do the bees differently. You have to start on so you start on the right side of the other. Yeah, you're right when you're doing the bees here, whereas in Paris, it's the left. So you have to avoid collisions if you're going between the two cities very often. And the eating schedule is quite different because in Nice, people tend to eat more casually at different times of day. There's a lot more eating outside, maybe eating standing up because there's a street food tradition here. So they're less formal generally. And the impression I got when I came here, it's like, does anyone work? Because everybody is kind of sitting on the terraces. And, the tram I noticed was not busy at normal rush hour times like it would be in Paris. So at 9:00, it's not that busy, but then it starts getting busy at 10 when the shops open because maybe people are working in the shops or they're going shopping, but there aren't a lot of traditional office jobs here. A lot of people who work in offices are actually leaving the city to go to Monaco or to go to Sophia Antipolis, where a lot of the tech people work. So the work culture is quite different. Definitely you can slow down when you come to Nice, and not necessarily my case because I run a business, but a lot of people come to Nice because they want a slower life and they're determined to have that slower life no matter what.
Yeah. You mentioned something that I definitely want to zero in on, because the market culture in Paris, I think, confuses a lot of people when they get here. They assume that because we have so many markets, we have a lot of farmers markets, and that's really not true. And that because we sell food in the street, we're encouraged to eat food in the street, which I also find is not really true in Paris. But in Nice, I know that there's a couple of markets, including a big central market really close to the beach. And there is this tradition of buying and eating food in the street. So could you tell me a little bit about the market culture in Nice and what you discovered from it?
Sure. Nice definitely has a street food culture. So when I first moved to Nice, something I noticed were these places where there were picnic tables and people would buy food like socca, which is a chickpea pancake that's popular in Nice, or pissaladière, which is the caramelized onion flatbread. And then they would just sit at these picnic tables and eat very casually with their hands. Eating with your hands isn't something you see that much in certain parts of France either. And so there is, if you go to the market, it's very normal for people to come and buy some soca at the market and just eat it as they walk through the market, or, be munching on something. And you also see the market vendors having what's called la merenda, which is a word used also in Italian and Spanish, which is the mid-morning snack or the late afternoon snack for the workers who've been up early and need something substantial to get them through the morning. So one example of that would be pain bagna, which is a sandwich, which is basically salade niçoise in a bun, which you'll see people eating, in mid-morning at the market or on the beach in the afternoon. At the end of the day, people bring food to the beach and share it. So there isn't that kind of stigma that you're not supposed to walk down the street eating like you might find in other places.
And we've mentioned the beach a couple of times for anyone who hasn't been to Nice. It's a kind of interesting paradox because it's France's fifth largest city, if I'm not mistaken. I think it's the fifth largest city.
That's true.
It has this big stretch of beach and the promenade that goes along it. And when we talk about a beach, it's not a sandy beach, it's a pebble beach. So there's lots of sort of geographic, topographic specificity that makes it a little bit of a strange place to call one of France's biggest cities. Do you feel like it feels more like a seaside town? Does it feel like a city to you? What does it feel like to you?
Nice is very interesting because it depends which part of Nice you're in. You're going to get a quite different feel to it. So my first 10 years in Nice were spent in the Old Town. I lived in the Old Town, which consists of buildings that date from the 15th to 17th centuries. And if you're in the Old Town, if you look at a map, it's shaped like a triangle. And the natural tendency, if you live there, is to walk in circles around it. So you'd never really leave the Old Town because you have all the shops, you have the beach just nearby, and you have all the bars and restaurants. So why would you leave? And people in the Old Town, it's definitely a village. And then if you leave the Old Town, the city starts to look more urban because the rest of the city was built mostly from the 19th century onwards. So it starts to feel a bit more like Paris. And now I live in a part of the city called Libération, which was built mostly in the 19th century. And the buildings actually feel a bit Parisian to me. And to me, I say it's like Paris with palm trees. So I love it because I love the feeling of the larger, the wider boulevards with the trees and more green. And the buildings are about the same height as the buildings in Paris with little balconies. So I feel like since I moved here, I feel more like I live in a city because I'm actually taking the tram back and forth, or maybe riding my bike around to get places, where when I lived in the Old Town, I never really had to take transport.
Okay, cool. And then, you mentioned some of the similarities between Nice and the rest of the south of France. When you think about the south of France, there's so many different areas. There's the Riviera, and then there's Toulouse, and then, the Southwest. And I'm wondering, when you think about Nice from a sort of cultural and historic perspective, are there other well-known cities and towns that you would sort of lump it in with from a cultural perspective that might have been part of that kingdom of Nice that only joined France in the 19th century?
Nice, the county of Nice actually stretched into the
county. Sorry about that. Not a kingdom.
Yeah, it was called, no, it's okay. It was the Kingdom of Savoy, which also included Piedmont and Sardinia. And then the area around Nice was called the County of Nice. And it actually it did include other towns along the coast, but smaller places, and like Villefranche. But it also went up into the mountains. So it's really interesting for me to go up into some of those towns that were once part of the County of Nice and see they have their own recipes for ravioli. They each have their own ravioli fillings. And sometimes the women get together and they'll have like a ravioli cook-off from different villages because they each have their own version, which I love. And Menton, if you go along the coast, is a very beautiful city architecturally. And it used to belong to another kingdom, which was Menton, Monaco, Roquebrune, and they separated. So only Monaco became the independent state. So there are similarities in the food and culture as you go along the coast, but it's interesting to me how each city looks different and has different specialties. Like in Menton, they have a specialty called barbajon, which is like a fried ravioli. It's a vegetable-filled ravioli, which is then deep fried. And you never see that in Nice, unless it's someone from Menton making it. So it's like cute. Yeah, sort of to me, I love going to these different places and just finding the dishes that are unique to that town.
If you're enjoying this podcast, you may enjoy our sister podcast, City of Muses. Each week, join City of Muses host Jennifer Garrity as she sits down with contemporary artists, dancers, and performers to explore what inspires them, where their ideas come from, and how Paris has helped or hindered their dreams come true. Inspiration and creativity meet in Paris, the City of Muses. Check out City of Muses now, available wherever you listen to podcasts. Navigating the French will be right back after a word from our sponsors. And now, back to Navigating the French. And in the names of some of these dishes, I feel like we're hearing echoes of maybe the Niçoise language. Is that still spoken, or are there words from Niçoise that have been borrowed into sort of the local vernacular at all?
Definitely. A lot of the food terms come from the local language Niçart, which is sometimes referred to as Niçart or Niçois. So words like ratatouille, words like pisaladia, which comes from pisala, which means salted fish paste, because the anchovy paste is mixed in with the onions. And a word that most of us know, which is mesclun, the salad mix, is actually from the Niçart language. And it just literally means mix in Niçart.
And I had no idea.
Yeah. That was because they traced it back to a monastery in the neighborhood of Cimiez, which is still there. It's a Franciscan monastery where they used to gather wild greens and mix them with cultivated greens and give these as a gift to the people who had helped them over the year. And, it was said that they were too poor to give anything else. So they would gather greens, and this mesclun became part of the diet locally. So there's never a meal here without mesclun. And another word people use is pichoun, which means child. So they often refer to kids as pichoun. And there are some rude words for describing people from Nice. Like there's an expression which is cagablea, and it means chard pooper, because people from Nice were said to eat so much chard that they pooped chard. And it's true that they do eat a lot of chard. So Swiss chard is a very popular and easy to find vegetable in Nice. So it goes into many different things.
And that actually leads me to another question that I had for you, which is I think a lot of the vegetables that we associate with Provence in general and Nice specifically are vegetables that pop up in a dish called ratatouille, which I actually spoke to you about for the BBC. So we'll throw a link to that previous story in the show notes. But essentially boils down to the fact that most of the vegetables that we think of, like tomatoes and aubergines and courgettes, aren't actually originally from Nice, and they would eat a lot of chard. So, and I think they have a lot of interesting ways of eating chard.
Yeah.
You delve into some of those ways they have of eating this very omnipresent vegetable.
Sure. Yeah, so the ratatouille vegetables did come to Nice around, I think, the 16th, 17th centuries, and people were a bit suspicious of them at first because they were nightshades, and now they are eaten, plentifully, but in the summer. So we would never make ratatouille in the winter. And yet chard is something that you can find all year round. And that's why people eat so much of it, because it just grows almost wild here. And it was originally a plant that grew by the sea, when it was a wild plant. So it just grows very well. It doesn't need a lot of water, and we don't have a lot of rainfall here normally. So different ways you can eat chard. One of my favorites is stuffed sardines, a dish called sardines farcies, where the sardines are butterflied and then topped with a mixture of finely chopped chard mixed with cheese, breadcrumbs, onion, herbs, bit of egg to bind it all together. And this is kind of spread over the sardines and then grilled. So you have the fresh sardines with this chard filling. And that's something quite original that I don't think you see other places. Another one is the tourteblette sucrée, which is a sweet chard pie. So it's actually a dessert made with chard. And you can imagine sometimes in the winter, people living up in the hills, they didn't have much to work with other than chards, but maybe they wanted a dessert. So they used sometimes they had rum, because people tended to use rum in pastry because of the access to rum from French colonies. And so they would soak raisins in rum and then mix that with chard, maybe some jam or sugar to sweeten it. And sometimes people would put Parmesan in this. So it was kind of a salty sweet thing. Pine nuts as well, and apple. And then you fill the pie with this. Originally it was an olive oil pastry. Now people use a butter pastry. Once it's cooked, people sprinkle it with a thick layer of sugar so that it's a sweet pie and not a savory one, because there's also a savory chard pie, which has rice and a little bit of ham or bacon in it, and also some Parmesan. So there's both the sweet and savory versions. Another chard dish I really like is truccia, which is an omelet, which is heavy on the chard with just enough egg to hold it together. And also some pine nuts, some herbs. I like to put mint and parsley in mine and basil in season. Then you just cook it very slowly like a frittata. And it's eaten usually room temperature, so it makes a really nice picnic food.
Awesome.
I could go on about chard recipes, but, you know, we'd be here in 2 hours.
People should probably pick up a copy of your book if they want more.
That's right. Yeah, there's plenty of chard recipes in there, but I tried to keep it reasonable. Like sometimes I cut some of them out because there were just too many chard recipes.
So I think I'm kind of now circling this recipe that a lot of people have heard of and a lot of people have very strong opinions about. And it's probably the reason why they know the word niçoise in the first place. And that is salad niçoise. So I have seen so many different iterations of it. I've seen people get very angry about certain people's iterations of it. Why do you think that this dish is so contentious? And what's your opinion on the best way to make salad niçoise?
So I'm going to say, first of all, salad niçoise is not a matter of opinion. It's a matter of, no, I'm joking. So I would say for the local people, it is not a matter of opinion because there's only one way to make it. And this would be with the accepted ingredients, which are summer tomatoes. So they have to be nice, sweet tomatoes, but a little bit firm, you know, not mushy because they have to hold their shape in the salad. So salad niçoise can be made from, say, late spring to fall. I wouldn't really make it in the winter because your tomatoes are not going to be good enough. And then it's raw, crunchy vegetables. And depending on the season, they might be different. So in the spring, you could use fava beans and you could use small raw artichokes, which have been trimmed, sliced very thinly, and marinated in lemon and olive oil for a little while. And then usually you'll find some radishes, thinly sliced radishes, spring onion. I'm just thinking of other vegetables. In the summertime, you would use peppers, which are long, skinny green peppers, which are often called Anaheim in California. I've seen them called that. So they're not spicy. And then you always have the tuna, which comes from a can or a jar. So a tuna packed in oil, anchovies, hard-boiled eggs, olives, and basil. So I hope I haven't left anything out. I did not mention salad greens because normally salad niçoise is not a green salad. In restaurants, they often put mesclun because they're trying to fill up the plate. But if I put salad, it's like a few leaves of crunchy lettuce, like, you know, the little gem lettuce that's quite crunchy. So a few like small leaves like that, I think is nice in the salad niçoise, but don't make it a green salad.
Okay.
So tomato is really the main ingredient. And then the dressing is usually very simple. So it's either lemon juice and olive oil or red wine vinegar and olive oil, just drizzled on. It's nice to salt the tomatoes a little bit first too, to let them, you know, drain a bit of their liquid. And that's really it. So I haven't mentioned potatoes or green beans because that most international versions that you'll see of salad niçoise is more of a potato, tomato, green bean concoction with maybe some seared tuna in the modern version, maybe some anchovies or not. So this version started with a chef named Escoffier, who was a famous chef at the end of the 19th, beginning of the 20th centuries. He was born in Villeneuve-Loubet, which is just outside Nice, and he worked at the Negresco in Nice. And then he later on went to work in international hotels, including the Ritz in London. And he developed this, what I call the international version of salad niçoise, which I think he probably developed out of necessity because potatoes and green beans were easily found compared to all these vegetables I mentioned, like radishes, artichokes, fava beans, which even here are seasonal. So I think this was the easy to make version, and I'm not against it, but definitely if you make that in Nice and call it a salad niçoise, you'll be called out in the local newspaper for it.
So I assume you have your recipe for salad niçoise in the book.
Yes.
Okay. I know I'm sure this is very difficult for you, but do you have a favorite recipe that's in the book right now?
Oh, that's a tricky one. There's one that I've mentioned a few times just because I think it's so unusual, and it's called peloton. And it's basically, you can translate that as naked ravioli. because peloton means small balls. And it's basically ravioli filling, which is rolled into little balls. So it's the filling, you can guess, it's got chard in it. So it's made with leftover beef stew meat. So the meat from daube, which is a beef stew cooked in red wine, mixed with finely chopped chard. There's parmesan, there can be bread to help hold it together a bit, a little bit of egg. And then you actually roll these in flour. So they have a very thin coating of flour, and then boil them. And if you've made them well, they won't burst when you boil them. They burst if they have too much moisture. But if they're just right, they're going to cook really nicely for a couple of minutes in the boiling water. And you serve them with a tomato sauce. And I love the way they kind of melt on your tongue. And there's no pasta, so it just seems very light. But just that little flour coating is very nice. So, of course, there's tons of recipes I love in the book. But that one, I think, I'm mentioning it because it's unusual, and it was such a surprise to me when I first tasted it.
Amazing. Great. Well, thank you so much for joining us today on the podcast. It's been so exciting to delve into everything that makes Nice so special with you, or just a part of what makes Nice so special. If people want to book a cooking class with you, what's the best way for them to find you?
I have a website, which is petitsfarcis.com. It's spelled Petitsfarcis. And that refers to a stuffed vegetable dish, which is also one of my favorite dishes. I can't believe I haven't mentioned yet. But I name my classes after it, which is how much I love it. And they can also find me on Instagram, Petit Farci Edible Paris.
Well, we'll put all of those links in the show notes so that everybody can find them. And I think there's also a Petit Farci contest every year, right? Have you ever participated in that?
I have watched it. Usually it comes at a very busy time of year for me. So I've never really found the moment where I could participate. But it's really interesting to taste everyone's versions of the Petit Farci, which is such a classic Niçoise dish. And it's made with very small vegetables, hence the word petit, and a mixture of meat, which is usually a mixture of veal and pork, with chopped vegetables, herbs. Some people use parsley. Some people add basil as well, garlic, onion, whatever vegetables they want to add, some parmesan and breadcrumbs, and then baked in the oven. And it's a really lovely Niçoise dish that originated as a thrifty dish. So beloved that this competition has a panel of 12 judges, most of them Michelin-starred chefs. So it's taken very, very seriously. It takes place at a wine bar called Cave de la Tour in the Old Town.
All right, we'll have to check it out. Thank you again for joining me. And anybody who wants to learn even more about all this deliciousness that Nice has to offer should definitely take a cooking class with Rosa, follow her on Instagram, and get a copy of Niçoise, which we will also be putting a link to in the show notes. Thanks again for joining me, Rosa, and have a great rest of your day.
Thank you.
This has been Navigating the French. You can find more from me, Emily Monaco, at Emily_in_France on Twitter and Instagram. This podcast is produced by Paris Underground Radio. To listen to other episodes of this podcast, or to discover more podcasts like it, please visit parisundergroundradio.com. Thanks for listening, and à bientôt.
This episode of Navigating the French was produced by Jennifer Garrity for Paris Underground Radio. For more great content, join us on Patreon at patreon.com/Paris Underground Radio.